Hey, what's up everybody? It's Lids, and we're back for some more Gwent, and today we're playing the Double Down seasonal event, which is an alternate game mode in which every card in our starting deck gets duplicated, and then whenever we play a unit, we will also play a random unit from our deck with the same provision cost. We had this event recently, but we're getting it again so soon, because after I told the devs about the spies bug, they fixed it. So this time it should be even better, and of course, we're using cards from the new expansion that are perfectly suited for this event. So let's go give it a look. So today we'll be playing a Northern Realms Pincer Maneuver deck, although technically speaking you could play this with Mobilization if you'd like. Pincer Maneuver for better consistency, Mobilization for technically better point scoring potential. The whole idea of this deck is that we're going to use the new Reavers cards, which, let's start off with the primary component of those Reavers, which is Reaver Hunters. Basically, you play them in the melee row, they can create a copy of themselves, and once you have at least 2 of them on the board, they will start damaging your opponent's strongest units at the end of your turn. So if you create a whole bunch of copies of these guys, then you can load up on a ton of damage that triggers at the end of your turn. And that is exactly what we're trying to do. So we have the Reaver Hunters, we have a bunch of ways to create copies of them, using things like the new Reaver Scout, the newly reworked Garrison, and also the new Boholt card, the Northern Realms Legendary from the Chronicles expansion, and if we play him, he will not only get boosted every time we create a copy of a soldier, but he can also create a copy of a soldier himself, and so the Reaver Hunters are going to be the card we want to create a copy of. And then, somewhat similarly, we have another engine that gains power based on how many copies of soldiers we create, and this is Kennet and Gar, and in their case, rather than getting boosted, they destroy a unit. And the power of the unit they can destroy is based on how many soldiers you spawned in once you put them on the board. So those are the things we are building around. Basically everything is all designed around creating as many copies of the Reavers as possible, and in doing so, powering up those engines. Then, we can use Princess Pavetta to move all the Reaver Hunters from our graveyard back into our deck and replay them in a later round using our leader ability with Pincer Maneuver, if you do choose to stick with that, or all of our tutors with Amphibious Assault, and Oneiromancy. So that's the core thing we're trying to do with this deck, but there is one other key thing that we're trying to do as well, and that is because all of those Reaver Hunters damage the highest enemy unit, and they will shift their damage from one unit to another to balance all that damage out, always hit the highest unit. That means that it is oftentimes going to be the case that our opponent has a lot of units with the same amount of power, which means Yennefer Conjuror, especially if you get 2 Yennefer Conjurors, which you can get in this event, you're going to more easily line up all of your opponent's highest units on the same number and get multiple damage off of each of these Yennefer Conjuror orders. So that's one way in which we can get additional damage, additional synergies, and potentially just wipe the entire board with this. But it also, by lining up a bunch of cards on the same number, does set up another huge card for us to ideally finish round 3 with, and this is Geralt Igni, because if we use him when our opponent has all their highest units lined up on the same number, then we can remove all of those units, which is potentially just crazy value. Quite literally could wipe the entire board. And so just bear in mind, if you're going to use Geralt, he's our only 10 provision cost card, so you will get your other Geralt out from your deck if you keep him there. And that means that that second Geralt obviously will not have the initiative because he's not going to be the first card that you play. So ideally you want to make sure that whatever row you're going to use him on has enough points in it that even after the first Geralt removes the tallest unit or units, it still has over 35 points so that by the time the second Geralt Igni comes out, that can still use its ability and it doesn't just become a 2-point break. But that's really all there is to it. Pretty much everything else is a tutor of some variety or a way to increase our consistency with stuff like Istredd, or, as we were saying before, create additional copies of the Reaver Hunters. So with all that being said, let's go see it in action. Alright, so going up against Scoia'tael here, and we'll go first. And we want to make sure we have the Reavers in our hand to build around that, of course. So that's a good sign. Other than that, have some tutors, and we have some low priority neutral special cards so we can dump them. Alright, and so to start things off here, let's begin by using Amphibious Assault to get a Reaver Scout out here. This is a card we'll use to create additional copies of those Reaver Hunters, and unfortunately we do have another 4 provision cost card, the Blue Striped Scout, which can at least create additional copies of the cards that we're eventually going to want to tutor out, but sometimes does mean you're going to be forced into playing one out from your deck when in truth you'd prefer to have a Reaver Scout instead. Now we can use Garrison. That's actually a nice little alternative to playing the Reaver Hunters directly from your hand, because that way you can still keep the Reaver Hunters in your hand and create copies of them using Garrison, and we can use the Scout to create additional copies of the Reavers on this turn. However, I'm deliberately not going to do that on this turn, and you'll see why in just a minute. We'll use our stratagem to fine-tune our hand a little bit further here, and just get another Amphibious Assault in here, and dump another one of our low-priority special cards. Okay, and Handget's Sword is unfortunate, not just because it's capable of removing one of the Reaver Hunters, but it banishes them, which means won't even go into our graveyard, which would have been nice, because we're going to use Pavetta to get them back out. This is why I waited to use the Reaver Scout until this turn, because that means now our first card that we played on this turn, our first unit, was a Reaver Hunter, so we got another one out from our deck, whereas if we'd done that on the previous turn, we would not have gotten that free Hunter out from our deck. And for that reason, since we've already played our first unit, I'm deliberately using a special to create another one of the Reaver Hunters here, using Casting Contest, so that we, because it's only the first unit we play, we get an additional copy of. We're still maximizing the value there and not playing any more Reavers than we have to. They pass early, so the Reavers were too much for them to handle, and we'll win round 1. And then, once again, let's get rid of the low priority specials here. And we still should have a decent number of those high priority cards in our deck here. Mostly the Scouts, less so with the Reavers themselves. In fact, we actually only had the 2 Reaver Hunters in our hand there, so that meant playing one from our hand would not have gotten anything out from our deck, and most of them are in our graveyard, which is why Pavetta is key, because once we play her, we can get all of those Reaver Hunters back into our deck, and now Double Down is benefiting us much more. And with the second round, just get a Reaver Scout. You know, if we had played more of them in round 1, that would have been a bigger factor. Not a huge deal. In this case, it's mostly just to get the Reaver Hunters back into our deck. They go Hawker support for some hand boosting, and even more at that. And so now we have lots of stuff we can tutor out with all of our tutors here, like Amphibious Assault, get these Reaver Hunters going, and get even more. Alright, Johnny, we'll set them up for damage, assuming they have more specials, and Malena is not a card we want to see, because those Reaver Hunters are row-locked to the melee row. So we need as many Hunters as possible in the melee row. They get moved out, they can no longer do their thing. And if they clog the melee row, which seems like that's the approach they're going to take here, then that can also limit the number of Hunters we can fit in the row. So can still spawn in more here, but Malena can become a big problem if they continue to use her to do that, and they will. Another Handget's Sword, we know they can use that to remove one of the Hunters, and then play the one that they destroyed in round 1, like so. And then Double Thumb the Sentry is an indication that, yes, they have every intention of doing more movement of the melee row. They're going to try to move us. So, yeah, don't like the looks of that. We can still go Oneiro, though. And with that, we could use Samum. Now, this is here primarily to, in case our opponent does have a way of creating copies of our Hunters, move them into the range row so that we can stop them from doing what we're trying to do to them. Of course, they do have Malena, so they could move, and do move, the Hunters back into the melee row, but it at least slows down their attempt to sabotage our Hunters. But now, double Francesca, and when they have Johnny on the board, that is pretty dangerous. So maybe we still try to go slightly further here. If we go Oneiro, we could see if we can go for the Yennefer here, and see how many other units we can get on the same number, because the Hunters do tend to help to level out the numbers on their highest units quite well, which means if we can keep Yennefers on the board, then they can be worth a whole lot to us. But they're going to move her now, and Simlas. Okay, so that obviously means tons of specials, so this is what they were trying to set up, and although, at least initially, the Dryad's Caress is not a damaging special, just by having Johnny on the board, the damage will certainly start to add up. And then with the second Simlas, it looks like this time it will be a damaging special. So although they have not done much to remove the Hunters yet, they can be much more deliberate with taking them out here. And with their hunter damage, basically remove all of our hunters here. I mean, we could try to get really clever and use Igni here, but I think at this point it's pretty clear we should be instead playing for round 3. So that, of course, means they'll win round 2. All right, once again, let's get rid of our low priority specials here. And the scout is not bad. Lots of tutors. And still should be a good number of units for us to tutor out from our deck. Most notably, perhaps, missing Kennet and Gar. But I think we can still make this work given how many tutors and leader ability charges we still have. All right, they go for Dunka for more hand boosting. And Harold Gord, maybe not what they were looking for this early, but he does actually have enough of a boost here to maximize his point total. But let's set up the scouts, and once again, unfortunately, we get the blue striped scout to create additional copies of them, when in truth, we'd prefer to just get them directly out from our deck here. Johnny again, so perhaps they're looking to do something similar this time around as well. But now let's get out the hunters here. Get another hunter out. And again, we could wait, or we could just go for this immediately. It means we're not going to get the extra hunter out from Double Down, but given how they have Johnny on the board here, I think there's a decent chance they could remove that scout if we were to delay any further. Doublethon a sentry, indication of additional movement here. So now we can create additional copies of those hunters using their order abilities, but before we do so, let's get Boholt using our leader ability, because he is too big to get with Amphibious Assault, and we'll put back out our Reaver Hunters into our deck, because I think we'll have plenty of hunters on the board here, and the limiting factor is just going to be board space in the melee row, especially if they do something like break out another Malena here. So the Boholts get boosted whenever we spawn in a soldier, and well, unfortunately, it is Malena once again, which is a pretty big counter for us. So we can still create another hunters here, but now our melee row is full. And so at this point, I mean, Voymir's a decent points line, but I think we get Istredd on the board, because the longer he stays there, the more his patience ability builds up. And especially with 2 Istredds, he can actually be worth a fair number of points, and of course just helps us fine-tune our hand if necessary. Gesras, though, now that's a very big card that they are pulling out here, and it's a double Gesras, of course. So we'd love to get rid of him with Igni. But the fact that they split him into 2 separate rows does make that a little bit tricky, because that range row is probably big enough for us to Igni, but the melee row definitely is not. So I think what we do here is we actually bide a little bit of time, because our melee row has some armor with all of our hunters. So it's not the end of the world if they get hit by at least one Gesras, and since we can still spawn in more hunters if necessary, even if some of them get destroyed, we can still bring some of them back. Now they do get rid of one of our Istredds, that's a little bit unfortunate. But they moved the Gesras's into the same row with Malena. Now that's potentially huge. Melee row, if we removed the first Gesras, the second Gesras can't be removed because we won't have initiative and they won't have enough points in that row. So I think that means Igni is on the next turn. So in that case, if we're waiting one more turn before doing that, might as well get Kennet and Gar out here now. And we can go Igni next turn and finish with Vanamar. Let's spawn in more of those Reaver Hunters, which, again, we can do because we still have some order abilities remaining that we were holding on to that we just didn't have the board space to do previously anyway. Just make sure you go for the ones that have the 2 base power, ideally. And so I know initially you guys might have been thinking, well, Lids, why didn't you just immediately get rid of the first Gesras? And they had a few cards in the range row that were lined up on the same amount of power, and you could have gotten decent value out of that. But why not get rid of the Gesras and a bunch of those other high-value cards all lined up as well at the same time? Because, like I said, they were boosting, but we're going to remove those boosts, by and large, with Igni, and we tanked some of the damage with our armor, and if we didn't, then we just used our order abilities to get the hunters back out anyway. So there is the double Igni, and that is pretty darn huge. Removes both Gesras's and some of those other cards in that range row as well. Click on the Istredd just to trigger that ability, and, you know, I think for the most part we're still looking to use Voymir as our finisher, but here you see if we needed to, we could have even made even more hunters. And they won't even bother playing that last card. They realize there is no way they can finish the job here. Voymir, of course, would be a decent finisher, but it doesn't matter. They'll forfeit, and we'll take the win. Alright, so going up against Nilfgaard here, and we'll go first. And our overarching strategy in this match remains the same. Create as many copies of the Reaver Hunters as we can to deal a bunch of damage. So just remember that for the next few turns, because for the moment, I want to talk a little bit more about that bug that I alluded to at the beginning of the video. Because trust me, this is going to be the perfect example of how, if they had not fixed that bug, this event would have continued to have been held back by a large group of players who deliberately chose to abuse that bug to the greatest extent possible. The bug was that if the first unit that you played on your turn was a disloyal unit, as they just played here, rather than double down playing the second unit from your deck, it would instead play the second unit from your opponent's deck. Though fortunately, as that previous turn just proved, that bug has now been fixed. The problem was, instead of building a deck around the spy's designed abilities, which our opponent just did there with a well-played infiltrator, players instead just spammed as many spies as possible, in some cases completely ignoring their abilities, such as playing a Duchess's Informant when there aren't even any cards to create copies of, just to drain their opponent's deck of all the 5, 7, 10, and to a lesser extent, 4 and 6 provision cost units. And it wasn't even like they were playing Assimilate units first to get that Assimilate triggered. They just constantly played spy after spy under what would normally be suboptimal circumstances, making it pretty clear that their only intention was to abuse this bug as their primary win condition. Now, call me crazy, but if your intention is to repeatedly and deliberately trigger a bug in a competitive multiplayer game as your primary way to win, then I'd say there's a word to describe that. Because although the bug did exist for a long time, and of course there have been times when people have legitimately played spies the way that they are designed to be played, this issue of players triggering the bug on almost, if not every single turn, was becoming increasingly common. And increasingly blatant. That's why I sent the bug report to CDPR in the first place and hoped that they could address the issue. So now that the bug has been fixed, I hope that that significantly improves the playing experience for everyone in this event. Because without the bug, Double Down is probably my personal favorite. Now, tying that into the game that we're playing right here, you may not have noticed, but that's what they've been doing every single turn. So maybe there's still a group of people who didn't realize that that has been fixed and were still intending to abuse that bug even now. But at least in this case, they have 2 Assimilate engines on the board, and at least the abilities on the spies that they've played have served a purpose thus far, so we'll try to give them the benefit of the doubt. Though what we have seen is that oftentimes when they play one of their spies, they're of course going to play the other copy of that spy from their deck, which means they played a bunch of units on our side of the board, which means our board is getting very crowded. And that's not good news for us, because we want as much room as possible in our melee row in particular to create as many of the Reaver Hunters as we can. Between that and some pretty big investments that they've made thus far, this round is getting a little bit out of hand. So they'll get a pretty good point slam and a lot of thinning out of Renfri's gang here, and of course that would suggest that they probably have Renfri herself that they plan to play later on. And they have the same amount of Reaver Hunters as we have, so it's not even like we're significantly out-engineing them or anything like that. So we can try to see if maybe Voymir is enough to at least get ourselves close, but we probably want this round to end pretty soon. Because, okay, after the Kennet and Gar Reaver Hunter removal, we have slightly more damage than they have, but even after that damage, they're still in the lead here, so this is getting really dangerous. Not to mention, we're pretty much out of board space here, so I think this is where we need to call it. Which does mean they'll take the round 1 win. But now we can get all of our tutors in round 2, so that's certainly useful. We still have Boholt, obviously that's huge, and we have 2 Garrisons, which we can both use to get more Reaver Hunters back onto the board. Alright, and this is where it starts to get a little suspicious, right? Turn 1, spy, nothing on the board to help synergize with it. They're just fishing for something here. Very clearly they are all in on spamming as many spies as possible, which is exactly what the bug spammers used to do. So I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt, but this is kind of what I meant. Cantarella, with nothing else on the board, is not going to proc Assimilate. If they get damage, at best it's a 0-point play. If they get boosting, at worst they might even need to boost the cards they put on our side of the board. So there's almost no competitively justifiable reason to make the play that they just made, so that just about confirms that this is exactly the kind of player that I was talking about. But since now, fortunately, Cantarella is the only spy that can play a card from our deck, as it's the only card that's supposed to do that, this also serves as a perfect example of how that means they really don't have a strategy. As you can see, they put more points on our side of the board than their side of the board. So while this row flooding is definitely an inconvenience, the worst they can do here is probably just force us to bleed out some of our better cards. And fortunately, because we have several sources of Reavers between our Garrisons and Pavetta, moving our previous Reavers that we played from our graveyard back into our deck, we don't need to worry too much about running out of Reavers, which is maybe what they're trying to force us into doing. But as you can see with all those Reavers on the board, we have a ton of damage. It's another blind Cantarell, and this is exactly what I mean. Golden Froth, they can't do anything at all with it. Actually, they're forced to boost our units, that Cantarell that they just played. So again, that's kind of just karma for making what is a play that was intended to sabotage us and really nothing else. But obviously, it backfired. And so now the question is, at 32-0, when can we end this round to stop the bleed? And for what it's worth, this is the first time that they've played something other than a Disloyal unit as the first card from their starting deck. They actually got a decent option from Aguara there. But we see here that in theory, they do have the tools to begin Assimilate deck, but we also saw that they consciously made the choice not to build around Assimilate in this round, which is case in point how players play Double Down differently than they would play Assimilate in Standard, even if that means they're playing substantially worse in Double Down. The only reason they're doing it is because they think it allows them to abuse a bug, but that bug no longer exists. And that means that in this case, they've just handed us a bunch of points, so much so the fact that they flooded our rows probably isn't even gonna matter. So it's not as if that was their justification for playing that way either, and basically made this round an automatic win for us. So all that is to say, in short, don't be like this. Obviously, if you were trying to abuse the bug, it just doesn't work anymore. And if you're still trying to flood your opponent's side of the board with spies, then hopefully this match serves as a bit of a case study in how that alone is not enough to do anything significant. So instead of stooping to the scummy strats, let's all just play Gwent the way it's meant to be played, and I think we'll all have much more fun in the process. Because it's a game. Ultimately, that's why we're here. And although the previous Double Down events had all the potential to be tons of fun, unfortunately, it tended to bring out the worst in us. But hopefully, as people realize that the bug no longer is a thing, and people who are trying to still run those decks realize that they can't win without the bug, people do turn back to actually playing Gwent. And now with Teleportation, we can even give them a bit of a taste of their own medicine, because with it, we can replay the Infiltrator on their side of the board, getting rid of one of the units they tried to flood on our side, and instead, flood their side of the board and deal damage to that Sorceress and prevent it from using its Order ability. So I really want to pass on our next turn, and the question is just, do they have anything big enough remaining that they could catch us with what few cards they have left? Not to mention, our side of the board is now completely full. That Ciri probably can't get boosted fast enough to go back to their side of the board, so we should be safe there. My biggest concern remains if they happen to have Regis, using that in our melee row could be devastating. But without that, the automatic damage we have even after we pass, coming from our Reaver Hunters, should still be enough that I feel reasonably comfortable passing here. Because if their previous turns were any indication, they probably don't have anything big remaining here. Yes, we did call their bluff, and because we used Pavetta, they didn't even bleed out any of our big cards. Alright, so we'll dump Golden Froth here. We don't really need that. Scout, probably not necessary either. Reaver Scout, a little bit better. We do still have more of the Hunters remaining in our deck, especially after using Pavetta, so we'll break some of them out right here. Immediately get the damage going. And we have the combination of Yen in hand and Oneiromancy we can use to get Igni, so those will be our finishers. So it's basically Hunters early, and then finish with the Yen plus Igni combo. Okay, another false Ciri. Now this time they might have enough time to get her boosted high enough to switch back over to their side, but even now I'm still not sure. So now, let's go and go with Leader ability, because with that, we can get Boholt, which gives us not only a way to spawn in more of the Reaver Hunters, but also get boosted in the process, and that's basically just a better version of Reaver Scout. Not to mention, Reaver Scout takes up some board space, which I'm still a little bit concerned about, because they played so many spies, they might still have more here, so it's basically Reaver Scout versus Casting Contest. Casting Contest does not take space, whereas Reaver Scout does. Because here we see, yes, it is indeed more spies. So we want to make sure that we have room for that Igni at the end, otherwise we could be in trouble if we can't use our finisher. A little bit of poison as well. That's our first time, I think, seeing that, but let's continue to create more of the Reaver Hunters. Get boosted in the process. And I suppose we'll play Yen here. And get the other Yen out as well, and with that, start dealing a little bit of damage and trying to line up as many of their cards as possible on the same number, so that when we do break out Igni, it is capable of removing a bunch of units simultaneously. Aguara, we saw them play before, but here's the other copy, and this time, oh, playing a unit from our graveyard, okay. another decent high roll at that, I suppose, but, well, it's more spies. So, again, concerns about running out of board space, so I think was a good idea to play it a little bit safe there and try not to load up on too much junk. Rothans, more spies, so yep, okay, now, I mean, this is still a relatively short round 3, but they have still been able to flood our side of the board with a lot of disloyal units that are not really helping us out here. So at this point, we can cast in contest. We don't have enough room to spawn in one of those Reaver Hunters, but I think we'll just make sure that we boost it up and use the Yens. And next turn, we might even throw away our Amphibious Assault because we want to make sure we have room for both Ignis. And if we play something with that Amphibious Assault, then we might not have the room to do that. So, okay, they're going for 2 Terra Novas, and those are decent engines, but I love that they're playing them in the same row because, hey, if you play all your big cards in that range row, that is just even more of an obvious Igni target for us. So, again, we're kind of running out of board space here. We'll use the Garrison order ability and the Yens as well. We can't really use Amphibious Assault. If we do that, we're going to take up our only remaining board space here. So, in the interest of still being able to play Igni, we need to make sure that we just discard that. So what is their finisher? They can create more of the Reaver Hunters, sure. And some assimilate here. Obviously, the earlier they would have gotten that out, the better, but it's a little bit late for it now. More Reaver Hunters. And Renfrey. Okay, we did see Renfrey's gang previously, didn't we? So I suppose that shouldn't come as too much of a surprise. Now, what do they get for their leader ability here? Spawn Stratagem. They have just enough space to do that, right? So, I mean, they're going for the boost, for what it's worth. And then, what was it? Play a bronze from their deck? They didn't remove a Boholt, even though they could have, so that was a little bit odd. But now the boost, yeah, they load up on one card, but since we have double Igni, we'll remove that one highly boosted card with the first Igni and then remove a bunch of other stuff with the second. So that's what Oneiro is here for. Here's Igni number 1. Obviously going to be range rogue here, I think, in both cases. Igni number 2. And then finish with the Yens as well for good measure. And that should be more than enough. They won't even see this one through to the very end. They forfeit and will take the win. So there's a look at a Northern Realms Reavers deck for the new Double Down seasonal event. If you liked the video, then make sure to hit the like and subscribe button and leave a comment down below to let me know which other cards, archetypes, and factions you'd like us to experiment with next. Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you next time.